So we are joined tonight by two people who are especially qualified to help us dig into that context. Lucy Dalglish is Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. From 2000 to 2012, she was Executive Director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, an association of reporters and news editors that protects the First Amendment interests of the news media. She is a recipient of awards from the National Press Foundation and Society of Professional Journalists and is an inaugural member of the National Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame. Prior to her legal career, Dalglish was a reporter and editor for the St. Paul Pioneer Press in Minnesota. Lucy was most recently in the news for her leadership on an open letter of concern signed by numerous journalism schools across the country and sent to Sinclair Broadcasting after the company required their anchors to read a corporate-produced commentary piece. And Trevor Timm is a co-founder and executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He's a journalist, activist, and lawyer whose writing has appeared in outlets including the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Harvard Law and Policy Review, and Columbia Journalism Review. He was the 2013 recipient of the Hugh Hefner First Amendment Award for Journalism. He formerly worked as an activist for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Before that, he helped longtime New York Times General Counsel Jim Goodale write a book about the Pentagon Papers case and the First Amendment. Just last week, he co-wrote a piece with Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, arguing that the Democratic National Committee's lawsuit against WikiLeaks was a serious threat to press freedom. So here's how we'll proceed. I'll first invite Lucy to the podium and then Trevor to take a few minutes to discuss what they consider to be the most important issues to frame our discussion about legal and historical context. After that, we'll take our seats and I'll pose a few questions to keep the conversation going. At 8 o'clock, we will turn it over to your questions. I think we've got one or maybe two floating handheld microphones. Since we're recording the event, please wait for the microphone to come to you. And we'll take your questions. We ask that you be brief and that you actually ask questions. And we'll do that for about a half an hour. So, Lucy, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Patrick. It's wonderful to be back here in Reno and to see Warren and Janet LaRude. I used to see them quite often when I, starting about 25 years ago, we would both teach seminars at the National Judicial College. So it's truly a pleasure, and thank you so much for your support of the First Amendment, as always, and for supporting today's events. I thought what I could do perhaps is give a little bit of historical context, because I was recently at a conference with a bunch of journalism deans, and they had a guest speaker who was a reporter who started railing about the Trump administration and how things were, all this partisan pressure and partisan reporting, and everybody's in factions, and nobody's objective anymore, and there was this long history of objectivity in American journalism. And I thought to myself, no, there isn't. And plus that, I've been reading a book recently about early American printers, and have found them to be some of the more interesting characters in our history. So I thought I would run through just a few historical ideas for you. So the partisan press, like we have now, or some people say we have now, is not new. From the time printing presses arrived in the colonies, early American printers were representing, they were representative of the media of their day, and they were not objective. They were our first opinion writers. Sorry, okay, I found some light now. Now, you can argue that even though objectivity has sort of evolved in different phases over our history, in many parts of the world, it's never been the case. I frequently will deal with international journalists, particularly those from South America, and they are all factional. They all have a perspective, and many parts of the world are accustomed to having their journalism framed either in a partisan way or from some other ideological perspective. So these days, being a journalist in the United States is a fairly safe occupation, But as you know, because the Reporters Sans Frontières survey came out today, journalism is still a very dangerous occupation in many parts of the world, particularly if you are a journalist working in Egypt, Turkey, Russia, Mexico, or as we saw last weekend in Nicaragua, when a journalist who was doing a Facebook Live story was shot in the head by government troops. Now, early American printers who supported the Crown, of course, knew what it was like to be the object of the wrath of people who didn't agree with their perspective. It was not uncommon in the pre-Revolutionary War era for printers to be tarred and feathered, jailed, or had their printing presses burned. And we all know that the Constitution was passed, and the First Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1791, and it included the first legal protections for the press in the First Amendment. Now, as time went on, more and more printers became journalists, or they were the publishers for other individuals who wrote for them, and they were doing journalists. But from the 1790s to about 1810, 1820, both major political parties sponsored newspapers. And the reason they had these newspapers was to get their political perspectives across to the public. Now, by 1800, newspapers became viewed as sort of a public property. Americans started believing that they had a right to the information without paying for it. Now, does this sound familiar? They would expect to be able to go to a coffee house or to a pub or something, and they would pass the paper from person to person. But they were relatively expensive back then, roughly 6 cents perhaps for one newspaper. So a cycle sort of started, because readers, even if they don't pay, if you're a publisher, those eyeballs matter. So the more eyeballs you had, the more you could charge the advertisers to support your newspaper. And besides, keep in mind, the parties were controlling these papers, so they were also trying to build influence. So it was in their interest to subsidize the papers in some way or another. And as the papers gained influence, so did individual publishers. Now, the internet can be really vicious. We've seen some really horrible things said about people on the internet recently. It comes to mind the terrible things the Fresno State professor said about Barbara Bush. And they can be very descriptive and very hurtful. But listen to some of these vituperative descriptions that you would have found in a newspaper back in that time. They would call someone a vile old wretch, a tool of a baboon, a frog-eating, man-eating, blood-drinking cannibal. Now listen to this one from William Cobbett of Porcupine's Gazette. I say, beware, ye understrapping cutthroats who walk in rags and sleep amongst filth and vermin. For if once the halter gets round your flea-bitten necks, howling and confessing will come too late. That's nasty. Now, by the 1830s, technology allowed high-speed presses to produce tens of thousands of newspapers to be printed every single day. And there was lots more competition for those eyeballs. So what would you do to attract those eyeballs? Well, you would write more creatively. You would have bright language. You would gossip. You would make money. So the new style of journalism remained ripe for discussion, but now we have added scandal and sensation, and what was referred to as the penny press grew, because those newspapers went from being a fairly expensive 6 cents or so to being worth a penny. Now we begin to see objectivity evolve as a concept in about 1844, with the invention of the telegraph. Basic facts mattered, and because some of our early publishers and printers had a lot of flowery language, if anyone's ever seen an old Western Union telegram, you know that it's just the facts. You don't waste words because words cost money. So more fact-based reporting was coming out. Also at about that time, the Associated Press was founded. And the Associated Press was looking for members from all factions, all sides, all perspectives. So the Associated Press started to follow more factual reporting instead of these slinging accusations and scandal mongering. By the mid-19th century, you had a guy by the name of Henry Raymond, who with a partner formed the New York Times. He started the paper in about 1851, and it was more erudite. It catered to an educated audience interested in foreign affairs. He had foreign correspondents. Historian Dan Schiller says that Raymond announced a new theory of journalism. A newspaper could be an organ of a nonpartisan, independent thought and still be thought well of and read in the interests of public policy. Now that's kind of the notion that I grew up with, that the First Amendment is there and newspapers were there with the notion of providing the information that citizens needed to make educated decisions in a democracy. This was a new concept. Now, after the Civil War, the number of newspapers grew like crazy. Every county had one. The frontier, places like Reno, developed newspapers. The ethnic press came out. There were newspapers everywhere. And in about 1890, the first investigative reporters started showing up. And they were serving the public interest by uncovering crime, corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, things like that we're accustomed to seeing journalists cover these days, like The Intercept, which is sort of their credential, investigative reporting. Now, not everybody liked that. Teddy Roosevelt disliked the negativism, and he said that these investigative reporters told lies. He called them muckrakers. He used that term to describe William Randolph Hearst, and that was a description that he found in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, because that was, a muckraker was someone who looks downward with a muckrake in their hands. In other words, they dealt with slime. Now, does this attitude and name-calling by a president sound familiar? Also, so it's not a new concept. These were the days of yellow journalism. There were more investigations, but also a lot more sensationalism. You could argue that the likes of Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst actually drove the Spanish-American War. There was more politicization of newspapers by owners such as Hearst and Pulitzer. Then radio and television came along, and newspapers were no longer the only game in town. So there was disruption to the system. Over a period of time, newspapers were used to being the major communicators, and now they were having to deal with broadcasters. We entered the mid-20th century, and there is another war. Factual reporting becomes very, very important. We had our first war really follow along in the trenches war correspondence, and a lot more simultaneous coverage of the war with folks like Edward R. Merrill broadcasting from London. Live news starts to be acceptable and, in fact, expected. So where is the law in all of this? Where does the First Amendment come in? Well, the concept of truth as a defense to libel, for example, emerged as early as 1734 when John Peter Zenger attacked New York's colonial governor, William Cosby. He was thrown in prison, but at his trial, Andrew Hamilton, the lawyer, was able to get him acquitted with the principle that truth is a defense to libel. And I would encourage you, if you ever get a chance, to read that original article that got him into trouble. It's quite fascinating, and you realize how these pre-Revolutionary War printers and publishers were in there mixing it up with the British. So that was established well before the First Amendment is adopted. But in 1931, we see the first law from the Supreme Court establishing freedom from prior restraints in the Neer versus Minnesota case, in which they said you could not shut down a scurrilous, scandalous newspaper because of something they published. Modern protections for journalists, or what I would consider to be modern protections for journalists, didn't really, I think, begin until about 1964, when the Supreme Court ruled that publishers have some leeway to make mistakes when they're covering public officials. And of course, that was in the New York Times versus Sullivan case. In 1970, we had the Brandsburg versus Hayes case, which I'm sure is something that Trevor worked with Jim Goodale in writing about. But even though there was not an obvious success supporting the notion that reporters had a right to protect their sources and other information, we were able to craft a common law interpretation of that case to create somewhat of a body of federal law saying that reporters can protect their sources in some instances. In 1971, for those of you who saw the paper, we have the Pentagon Papers case, establishing really in a solid way that in this country you don't get to shut down a newspaper or ban publication just because it was sensitive information. You have to have a very, very good reason, and so far we really haven't had an instance where a court found a very, very good reason to censor journalism. In 1976, there was the Nebraska Press Association versus Stewart case, which established the right of a public trial, and that you could not just kick somebody out of a courtroom. A public courtroom is a public courtroom. In the 1980s, we further established that principle in the Richmond Newspapers versus Virginia case. So I think in the 1960s and 70s, 1960s, 70s, and 80s were really the heyday for free press rights. But we have a very solid body of law to rely upon, and we rely upon it almost every day. And it's something that I got to see up close every day when I was working at the Reporters Committee. So now we have a president who claims that the media reports fake news and calls journalists names like the enemy of the people. Is this new? Is this something we need to be really afraid of? No, not really. Should we be scared? No, we need to fight on. And we need to make sure that people understand this rich history of the media and the back and forth that we've lived through. We are in another time of disruption, and this disruption is unlike any disruption we've seen in the past. I don't know how we're going to get through the disruption that the internet brought and the problems it has raised for the traditional business model of journalism, but I'm confident that you journalism students here in the audience are going to figure it out, along with some of the rest of you who are technologists and some of the rest of you who are business majors, and that we will be able to figure it out, and that good journalism will triumph. So, thank you very much.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. So I wanted to talk a bit about press freedom in the age of Trump and how we got here and what press freedom might look like in the next 5 to 10 years. You know, it's interesting that press freedom has really shown up a lot in the news in the past year and a half. And that's partly because Trump has made it such an issue. Immediately, as soon as he started campaigning 2 years ago, he started threatening to sue news organizations that he disagreed with. He threatened to sue the Washington Post. He threatened to sue the New York Times, the AP, Huffington Post, Rolling Stone. I actually ended up going back and counting how many times he threatened to sue a news organization just when he was running for president, and it totaled at least 14 times. And that was only the amount that I could count, given that some of these news organizations, I'm sure, kept these threats silent. He has gone on these daily name-calling tirades with reporters, as Lucy was just mentioning, calling pretty much every major news outlet fake news. He called BuzzFeed a pile of garbage. He called the New York Times and others the enemy of the American people. And he has promised to, or at least during his campaign, he promised to open up libel laws because he had, for 20 years been threatening news organizations with lawsuits, never had much success, and wanted and expressed an interest in making it easier to bankrupt them. I think as a side note, it's kind of ironic that Trump wants to open up libel laws for one reason. He doesn't seem to understand that there is no federal libel law, that the Supreme Court ruled 50 years ago in a series of cases that established the current precedent for libel law, and that there's no law that he can magically change. But the other thing that's the most ironic about this is that Trump would probably be the first person to go bankrupt because of this libel law, given that he decides to spout off on every single enemy that he's ever made on Twitter on a daily basis. But none of these instances, at least up until his campaign, really used the awesome power of the U.S. government to actually go after journalists. It was really after the election that we had to start thinking about, okay, if he is this obsessed and this upset with the press, how can he use his powers to do lasting damage? Unfortunately, the tools that Trump is using now and may use in the future were really crafted for him, unfortunately, by the last administration, the Obama administration. Now, obviously, Obama is the total opposite of Trump when it comes to temperament and his rhetorical style. When President Obama used to talk about freedom of the press, it was often using soaring rhetoric that probably made journalists smile. But unfortunately, his Justice Department was one of the worst for press freedom in a generation. There was actually more leak prosecutions of sources of journalists during the Obama administration than all other administrations combined. This was after Obama had campaigned on being the most transparent administration ever and actually protecting whistleblowers. Several of these leak prosecution cases directly involved the surveillance of journalists. There was one case in particular involving former New York Times reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner James Risen, where he spent several years under subpoena, being forced to testify against his source or go to jail. When the Obama administration dropped the subpoena on the eve of the trial, they revealed that they had Risen's credit card records, his email records, his phone records, his bank records, his travel records, basically indicating that they could prosecute his source whether he testified or not. There was actually several of these scandals. There was one involving the AP, the Associated Press, where the Justice Department had secretly subpoenaed 20 of their phone lines that affected, the AP said, over 100 journalists just to root out a source. There was another case where the Obama administration, or the Obama Justice Department, said in court documents that a Fox News reporter was aiding and abetting violations of the Espionage Act and potentially a co-conspirator, essentially accusing a reporter of breaking the law for attempting to go through the what is a regular news gathering process. And in the Fourth Circuit, the Justice Department in 2014, in that same James Risen case, got the Fourth Circuit to essentially declare that there is no such thing as reporter's privilege, and dealing a significant blow to the legal rights of reporters who cover national security issues. And so these are the tools, unfortunately, that Trump now has at his disposal. The Trump administration has already brought 2 leak prosecutions, one with Reality Winner, a former Air Force veteran who leaked information about alleged Russian hacking of election infrastructure. Another just pled guilty a week ago. His name is Terry Albury, and he gave documents to The Intercept about FBI practices involving investigating minority communities and religious minorities. He actually even gave The Intercept a document about press freedom itself. The FBI actually has secret rules for targeting journalists with national security letters, a kind of controversial and many think unconstitutional surveillance tool that doesn't require any sort of judicial sign-off, which the FBI can serve on a company like AT&T or Verizon, and again, to root out journalist sources. And actually, we are, Freedom of the Press Foundation, along with the Knight Columbia Institute at, the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia, are suing the Trump Justice Department right now to try to release the current rules for targeting journalists with national security letters. And so far, the Trump administration has been stonewalling us. But really, it's too early to say, what type of legacy Trump will leave when it comes to press freedom beyond his kind of verbal tirades or Twitter tirades that he goes on pretty much every week. But, at Freedom of the Press Foundation and a whole coalition of other press freedom organizations, including Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and the Committee to Protect Journalists, kind of got together right after Trump was elected. And we had seen what had happened during the Obama administration, and we saw coming what was about to happen with the Trump administration, and realized there needs to be a better way to document and kind of understand the actual state of press freedom in the U.S. Because certainly we have the First Amendment and have many more rights than people around the world. Journalists do not have to worry about being killed in their line of work in this country, and that is a blessing. But there still are real problems in this country. And so along with these other groups, we decided to build a database and actually a news site in itself that would report on press freedom issues. So in the summer of last year, we launched what we call the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, and you can find it at pressfreedomtracker.us. And so what we are trying to do is essentially document and count in a comprehensive way for the first time all sorts of categories of press freedom violations in the U.S. So we count the number of journalists arrested in the United States, the number of journalists physically attacked. We try to count the number of journalists who receive a subpoena by state or local or federal governments, the number of journalists who are stopped at the border, the number of leak prosecutions, the number of journalists who we know have a legal order for surveillance issued against them, about 15 total categories. This was actually inspired by the Washington Post and how they started counting police shootings in 2014 when there was no reliable data to understand how many shootings were happening across the U.S., even though we saw them in the news constantly. And that's what's been happening over the past few years. There has been story after story of protests happening in the U.S. Where journalists go to cover these protests just to inform the American public and not participate themselves, yet they end up in the back of a police van with handcuffs, with their hands handcuffed behind them. And so in 2017, we actually counted over 130 incidents on the press freedom tracker. And so with every incident, we actually hired a full-time reporter to report these incidents out. So you can go to the site and actually read interviews with all of the journalists affected. We counted 34 arrests in the United States. 44 journalists were physically attacked. Another dozen or so had their cameras searched and seized. There was at least a handful of border stops, and almost all of these are actually undercounted because a lot of times people do not want to make themselves the story. They may have a lawyer who is asking them to not talk about the incident because there's an ongoing case. In fact, right now in Standing Rock, there are still a handful of journalists who are facing serious felony charges from incidents from over a year ago. And so, it's not just the kind of top level kind of Trump hatred of the press that is a real press freedom problem. That also filters down into state and local issues. And it's something that with the Press Freedom Tracker, we hope to be able to, number one, highlight so people understand that this is a problem, but number two, provide context when other journalists get arrested. We can say, we've seen this trend rising for a few years. But number three, hopefully making those authorities who decide to arrest a journalist in, say, St. Louis when there's a Black Lives Matter protest going on, think twice because they will hopefully be held to account by, not only us, but journalists around the country who might cover the issue as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to Patrick.
Says it's on. There we go. Okay, so I had a couple of questions that I sort of thought about starting with, and I actually think I want to skip down my list a little bit because I think there's one that kind of gets at some themes that you were both talking about a little bit, which is I'll say the relationship between the press and the public, because I think there's some themes in that we can think about in terms of in the age of yellow journalism or in the age of when people really align themselves in the partisan press with, either one newspaper or one, point of view because they're sort of, well, I read this newspaper because that's my political point of view being supported. And I wonder about whether, and then of course today where I think it's fair to say that there's, quite a bit, the anger at the press and the frustration sometimes with the press doesn't begin or end with the White House. It certainly is something it's cyclical. I think that the Trump administration and Trump himself sees as something to seize on, and you go to a rally and you point back at the cameras in the back of the room and you say, there they are, hate them, tell them what a terrible job they do, and don't worry, they're not going to show it on the news anyway. And I wonder about, so press freedom scholars tend to say that the First Amendment is not self-executing, right? That we rely on institutions and the public generally to support the notion that freedom of speech and freedom of the press are a good idea and that they, we shouldn't allow that to be sort of withered away or chipped away at. And at a moment where there is a kind of widespread, often distaste for or even distrust for the press, is that itself a threat, do you think, to press freedom? Or is that, you can reject the premise as well and say that, people don't, people do trust the news media more than maybe as I'm characterizing it.
Well, I'll take the latter. I'll disagree with the premise.
Okay.
That's because I think that a lot of times when we talk about the media and look at polls regarding people's trust in the media is such a vague term that it's hard to wrap your head around. I mean, there are a lot of media outlets that I don't like, that I don't trust, I'm sure somebody with the opposite political views as mine has the same opinion about a totally different set of media outlets. So do we count the media as cable news? Do we count it as the network nightly news? Do we count it as major newspapers? Do we count it as alternative blogs? Do we count it as social media? When you lump all of these things together, people will naturally have a tendency to trend towards the negative. And so, I think if I heard that question, or if I heard it just kind of a general poll question, do you trust the media? I might hem and haw and say, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends on who it is. And so I think that often turns into, no, I don't trust the media. Certainly there is a lot of trust issues with certain parts of the media, some deserved and some don't. I mean, I think Donald Trump has used this kind of daily barrage of insults as a way of trying to signal to his base that they shouldn't believe anything that these people say, so that when the scandal of all scandals hits, they will still support him. And we've seen that. Like, he seems to have a floor of support that the polls won't go below it, no matter what happens. But then it also has a backfiring effect too. The press has become, over the past 18 months, much more aggressive and adversarial towards the administration because he has taken that tact first. I think if he had taken a more nice approach, he actually would have gotten better coverage, and it's kind of ironic to think that, but in some ways it's actually a good thing that there is this adversarial relationship going on.
I think I agree with most of that. Is my mic on?
It is.
Okay. It's interesting when you talk to researchers who talk to people in communities and you ask them that question. Their trust in their local media outlets, citizens still seem to trust the folks that they know and rely upon every day. The folks that they tend to not trust are the networks, the big papers. If you're a Democrat, you don't like the Wall Street Journal. If you're a Republican, and I'm really generalizing, you probably don't really like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Or you find reasons, to identify a partisan type perspective in publications that I think most of the time is hard to find. But they're mostly talking about cable television that the 24-hour news cycle has sort of forced us into. But trust in local broadcasters, trust in local newsrooms in general, I think is still pretty high. Is there trust in a lot of online-only, popular but less well-known publications? I don't know. I haven't seen much research in that. I will tell you this, however, from my perspective being at a university for the last 6 years. My journalism students have a pretty darn good grasp of the First Amendment and the 5 freedoms that you find in it. They have because we've hopefully taught them to cover courts and other institutions and do news stories, they seem to have a pretty solid grasp of the rest of the Constitution and basic civil rights because they're kind of engaged in their communities. Many of them have come from high schools where journalism was encouraged and supported. But that's not what I'm finding in general students on campus. I just finished chairing a 9-month-long task force on inclusion and respect on our campus. And one of the things we discovered was that more so than in probably the last 50 years, since 1968, students are willing to shut down people that they disagree with, and they don't want to hear anything about the First Amendment. If you come out and somebody raises an issue and they want, there's a nasty symbol that appears on campus, or someone was insulted or offended, the last thing, and I've been to workshops where they've told university administrators this, if your response has anything to do with the First Amendment, shut up and start over, because that turns people off. You have to start out first with empathy for the people who were hurt by the statement, and then you go, of course, there are rights in this country. We have a long way to go toward re-educating people about what the protections that we have in our Constitution. And to me, that's, I guess because I've been so immersed in it recently, I find that even more frightening than anything that has been happening to the media specifically.
Do the media, I think the obvious answer perhaps is yes, but do any news media in particular or as a group have a responsibility or a role to sort of play in educating the public? Because it can certainly come off as sort of self-righteous when the news media starts banging the drum for the First Amendment, because it's obviously something very easy for them to say, well, and then we're going to hide behind it as we sort of take pot shots at whoever we don't like.
Yeah, I think we have to get other institutions in society more involved. Traditionally, this is another thing historically about the newspaper industry and early broadcasters. If you were shut out of a public meeting, if there was a court case where you couldn't get the records or something, who was it that was going to come in and assure, usually through legal action, that the public has access to that information? It was going to be local media. They were going to spend the money in the public's interest and in their own interest to get that information. News organizations have fewer available dollars to pay for that these days. So that's another thing I worry about. And there are not that many other folks, certainly the ACLU will step up in many cases, but we have to start relying on other people and other institutions and groups to start speaking up in support of these ideas, because you're right, we can sound very self-righteous.
Kind of along those lines, I'm kind of curious about this, and it's a little bit more of a pointed question. I think we can answer in slightly shorter strokes, perhaps. But it's one thing that's interesting to me about constitutional law and about politics and history is how particular decisions or precedents can kind of sit and be mothballed for some time, and then all of a sudden become very relevant. And then sort of go away again, and sort of, and of course, along the way, new decisions will come along that will put a new gloss on some of those already established precedents. And I'm wondering if there's a particular kind of, either just sort of in our particular moment, if there's a particular case, U.S. Supreme Court case, presumably, or a particular piece of legislation, either, somewhere in the works or that has recently been passed that you think is going to be particularly important, or can sort of have either new relevance or continuing relevance in the current environment and landscape?
I think that 6 or 7 years ago, a lot of people had forgotten about the Pentagon Papers and the Pentagon Papers case. Now there's just been a movie made about it by the most famous director and 2 of the most famous movie stars in the world, and so it's kind of having its new heyday for good reason, because I think a lot of the reporting coming out of the Trump White House reminds a lot of people about the Nixon days, when Nixon was calling the press the enemy, where he was wiretapping journalists, and where he even went to court to try to censor the New York Times and the publication of the Pentagon Papers. And we've seen this issue, the issue of the right to publish classified material that's in the public interest surface many times over the past 5 or 6 years, first with WikiLeaks and State Department cables in 2011 and 2010, then the Snowden revelations that were published in The Guardian and The Washington Post and other papers in 2013, and now we're seeing all sorts of leaks coming out of the White House. And it's, been relatively well-established law ever since the Pentagon Papers in 1971 that the government really can't go to court to try to stop the publication of a story like this. So much so that even during the WikiLeaks and the Snowden revelations, the Obama administration didn't even really consider it, as far as we know. But already in the Trump administration, his lawyers have sent cease and desist letters and have threatened to go to court to try to get prior restraints in multiple occasions. First, with the Michael Wolff book, Fire and Fury. They claimed that they were going to get a prior restraint, or attempt to. The same was happening with this Stormy Daniels scandal. Where they are in court trying to actually gag her from telling her story. And so you can imagine that Trump would take a similar tact if there was a story involving whatever controversial thing that they're doing in foreign policy or national security. And we're only 18 months into the Trump administration, and so I wouldn't be surprised in the next 2.5 years if we see a case like that.
One of the things that makes the United States almost unique is this concept of no prior restraints. If we were in the UK, a lot of national security information, individuals who deal with it would be subject to the Official Secrets Act. And the concept of censorship is very, very real in almost all other countries. The notion that you cannot issue a prior restraint or censorship on something prior to publication is an American thing. And I also agree, I agree that of all the things I worry about, it's something along these lines that's going to pop up at some time, and somebody might actually pay attention to it in the courts, and they might be able to persuade someone to attack this legal precedent. So I don't know, whether it be through an attack under the Espionage Act or, it'll probably be some stupid lawsuit involved with some stupid problem or something that he or someone close to him has gotten involved in, and we'll see long line of cases just start to crumble because of some really ridiculous, horrible case that doesn't even involve national security.
Would it be death by 1,000 cuts, or would you expect a sort of a particular, a landmark case that 20 years from now would be
I don't think he has time
saying?
for death by 1,000 cuts.
Okay.
I mean, he's got, 2.5 years left. And court cases, they take a while. So I wouldn't expect anything to happen overnight. But, it took a while to build us to where we are with the precedents I outlined earlier. And I would just hate to see the corner turned and go in that direction. I mean, with the WikiLeaks leaks, the Snowden leaks, everything, I mean, the law held up really, really well. But that doesn't mean it always will.
This is another sort of quick, short one, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. You may or may not know that student newspapers across the country are involved in a Save Student Newsrooms Day of Action today. And I'm just kind of curious, certainly from the perspective of a dean, we talked about student newspapers a couple of times today. I know you're very proud of the work that Maryland students do. And Trevor, I wonder about kind of your perspective a little bit on this as well. That essentially the role of student media in perhaps helping educate the public about some of these things, or what are we? Is the threat that a lack of independent student media on campuses might pose? Is that sort of something we should genuinely be worried about, or is it something that, well, it's, not that big of a deal? Universities aren't what they used to be, or, it's not something we should worry about as much as maybe student journalists would tell us we should be?
Well, I was the editor of my first paper when I was in 6th grade, so I also got grounded by my father for an editorial. I'll tell you about it later.
Prior restraint.
It was a prior restraint, and I pointed this out to him. I said, I go to a public school, I have First Amendment rights. And he said, I am not a public institution, I am your father. So that was the end of that. I wrote about him. I really shouldn't have done it. It was tasteless. I'll tell you one thing that surprised me, being in an administration of a university right now. When I was a student journalist, I took myself very seriously, and I worked very, very hard. And over the years, I've worked with a lot of student journalists who are out there, and they're learning. And sometimes mistakes get made, and those are teaching moments for the rest of us. But what I really can't get over is about once a month I hear from an administrator or somebody involved in a story having to do with one of our student journalists. And these people, it's like the world has come to an end or something. They get so worked up, and you just want to say to them, oh, get a grip. Did you call the student back and point out to them what mistake might have been made, and tell them that the next time something like this comes up to be sure to call you? And you're an educator, for God's sake. But I can tell you, people really, really do worry about student journalism. It's kind of reassuring in a way.
Yeah, I mean, student-led newspapers and journalists and newspapers on campus are where the journalists who cover Trump right now learned their trade and learned their craft. It's the first place that they can learn how to speak truth to power, where they can learn their rights as student journalists by covering issues on campus, even by, and especially by, getting in fights with the administration. And I think it is an incredibly valuable learning experience that will shape somebody's career for 30 or 40 years. I mean, you just heard about that amazing memory from 6th grade. So, I'd love to hear more about the day of action. I didn't actually know about this until a couple hours ago, but so what kind of actions are people taking today?
I don't know a lot about it either, aside from, there's a hashtag to follow. That it's sort of collective across a bunch of news organizations. Started with the University of Florida student newspaper. I think it picked up steam and sort of added fuel a little bit when just this week the Southern Methodist University decided to sort of fold their student newspaper. They had a sort of board of student media directors that said that this isn't really a viable enterprise, and made the sort of financially based decision to fold it and do away with it. In spite of alumni sort of trying to gather and say, hey, we'll put together a bunch of money. I think they had at one point had about $50,000, $40,000 or $50,000 pledged to try to support the institution. And I think, so the concern is a level of independence that might be deteriorating, where just as news organizations across the country are facing challenges in getting advertising revenue to support the work that they do, student news organizations depend very much on financial independence to translate into institutional editorial independence, when they have to sort of depend on the institution for office space and funding coming out of student funding and things like this. I think it can be a challenge when they're entirely reliant on an institution, which is often not in line with the work that they're trying to do. And so that's that's the impetus for this, and I think there's kind of a recognition. Student news organizations can often kind of be working isolated from each other. They don't always necessarily connect with each other in the same way that I think even local newsrooms will do, thanks or no thanks to, sort of corporate consolidation and some of these sorts of things. And so I think it's a kind of raising of awareness about the value of these institutions on their campuses, and as certainly as learning tools and as places of learning, but also ways that that they can keep the institutions accountable themselves outside of whatever local media might be or might not be able to dedicate a full-time reporter to the campus. So I think that's part of the thing too. But maybe one of our student journalists will add to the conversation as well, in the form of a question. So hopefully I have real trouble seeing under these lights if there's a microphone floating around or if there's somebody waving a microphone or somebody can grab a microphone from the back and start walking around with it. I see Warren. Do you have a microphone, sir?
He probably doesn't need one.
And I'll try to interpret your question for purposes of the video.
We are in a new time. And in our curriculum, we have several classes where, among the things you're doing, you're talking about the business model far more than you ever did when I was a student or when I was working as a journalist. I used to joke when I was at the Reporters Committee that we were always in financial trouble because nobody on our board, they were all journalists, ever wanted to raise money because journalists think even talking about money is unethical. Well, those days are over. If you don't somehow get involved in understanding and maybe working with the business model, you're not going to be able to do journalism any longer. You're just not. And we're encouraging our young journalists to become entrepreneurial, perhaps start their own businesses. That's going to be a part of what we do in the future. And quite honestly, that's also part of the old model. The first journalists were these printers, and they were business people. The reasons the printing presses came over here, the first thing they printed were pamphlets and other commercial things, but they were mostly printing shipping schedules going across the Atlantic Ocean. So, this notion of complete and utter independence from understanding what the business model is, that's also a relatively new concept. And certainly small town publications in small town, the smaller you were, the closer you were to actually getting involved with, the support of the publication. As far as, it breaks my heart, I changed airplanes in Denver today, and my God, not so long ago they had 2 terrific newspapers, and the notion that they're close to being out of business just horrifies me. On the other hand, going and asking, inviting someone in the local business community, somebody local, to come back and be the homegrown owner, I think that's worked in some places. Adelson, I'm familiar enough with Nevada to be a little bit nervous about that. But it's worked in places like Minneapolis, where McClatchy used to own the Star Tribune. Then a venture capital fund came in, declared bankruptcy. Things were in total disarray. The newspaper had a few years of just horrible things happening to it. But then a Minnesota businessman named Glenn Taylor came in and bought the paper, and you know what? It's the first thing I read every morning. I go to startribune.com. I recommend it. It's great. But Dr. Patrick Schung, the guy from LA, he just bought the LA Times from Tronc. He wants to go in there and study. I'm told by people who've been in meetings with him that you go into a meeting with him and it's like he sucks your brain out. He wants to know everything. I think it's kind of heartening if you find the right kind of sort of hands-off the content local owner. It can be a good thing.
Yeah, and actually we've seen, at least on the national level, for the first time, this kind of model of journalists actually promoting and asking people to subscribe actually work with the New York Times and Washington Post. After the election, their subscriber count surged to the point where I think the New York Times at least is already or is about to have more subscription revenue than advertising revenue, which has never happened. So we haven't actually seen this work on the local level yet, but that doesn't mean that it can't, and it might very well work if there is a concerted effort, like you were describing, for reporters to actually reach out to citizens of a particular city. The LA Times is another perfect example of journalists doing really brave work, actually reporting on their owners and their publishers. They went through this really tough unionization fight and weren't afraid to call out their own owners at Tronc as they were, had their pay stagnated for years in the newsroom, reporting on the $5 million bonuses that all of the executives got. I think, part of the reason why it looks like they're getting towards a happy ending is because the journalists inside the newsroom were so aggressive in sticking up for their own rights and also, telling the public what was actually going on.
Well, it was a fascinating situation, I think, because the LA Times wrapped together both the sort of reporting on their own ownership and encouraging people to subscribe to the paper, but then also it was in the midst of the union push that they were sort of saying, if you value our journalism, you should support the unionization and the paper. I thought that was sort of a really interesting thing. So they were trying to demonstrate that sort of, a strong workforce is kind of what helps make a news organization strong, and I think that, if nothing else, a really sort of savvy move to kind of demonstrate to the ownership that this was, something that they shouldn't push back too hard against it, that being the unionization. So, another question? Are we just not going to do the microphone? Oh, here we go.
Microphone.
Thank you, Jesse.
I'm Madeline Purdue. I'm the incoming editor-in-chief of the Nevada Sagebrush, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Safe Student Newspapers campaign. Patrick pretty much hit it on the head, where it's about bringing awareness to funding and independence issues of student newspapers across the country. And so the question that I'm posing in that way is that these universities expect 19 to 21-year-olds to solve the business model issue that, national news organizations haven't even solved while remaining independent. So really, what independence, how does independence play into the coverage that student news organizations give to these micro communities, if that makes sense?
Well, so you were talking earlier about how the student newspaper is funded at the University of Maryland, and I thought that was really interesting.
There are a variety of models for a student newspaper. One is the college or the university actually runs it as a class or as part of a curriculum, or operates it as an arm of the journalism school. Or it could be funded by student fees and have some sort of a board of student publications, which gets it a little bit more independence. Usually those folks are kind of hands-off. You get the fee money and it supports it. Maryland is one of those schools where in 1970 or so, the journalism school allowed the newspaper, the student newspaper, to go completely independent. So it is owned by a nonprofit that has a local community board. Some of them are alums. There is a professional business manager. It's supported by advertising revenue. And it has absolutely nothing legally to do with the University of Maryland. Now, there are other schools around the country, and they're still hanging on. It's tough, but they're hanging on. Some schools that had more of the slightly an independent model, where they were maybe supported by fees, but things were not going well with their advertising. Penn State and LSU, the student journalists and the boards went to the journalism schools and said, would you please take us over? And of course, that put it squarely on the shoulders of the dean of the journalism schools to come up with the money to support student journalism. And, you know, that, it all comes down to money, basically. But, you know, in my mind, I love having a completely independent newspaper because they can be adversarial. I think they learn a lot. I take fewer angry phone calls from people complaining about the students. But, you know, the only way to have a truly independent voice and have no risk of being interfered with your editorial voice is if you have that independence. And if you get sucked into a college or a school or something like that, you know, it's going to be a riskier move, and it's going to be harder, not impossible, but harder to maintain independence.
And with that independence, of course, comes the ability to criticize and sort of be a voice for the student body.
You know, I used to worry about that. I mean, there are some places where they're going to pick on you, and you're going to get into more trouble. Certainly, the folks who have the toughest lot in life are the ones who go to private schools where the administration can truly run your life, make your life miserable, and shut you down. At a public university, there is, if a president of a university or other high administrators were to really go after student journalists, in this day and age, I think there'd be real payback for that. The president would be in quite a bit of trouble, unless whatever it was the newspaper did was just beyond the pale. I think you can still maintain a certain amount, you know, a pretty good amount of independence, and feel free to criticize. I mean, heck, I don't know why the student newspaper wouldn't criticize what I do. I've got students and faculty and alums criticizing what I do every single day. You know, nobody at a university ever seems to be hesitant to speak their mind. So I don't know why a student journalist should be hesitant to do that.
I think just one note that Wichita State University's student newspaper earlier this year went through a situation where they were dependent on student funding, which of course the purse strings are held by the student government. And so the student government, dissatisfied with some of the reporting that the student newspaper had been doing, they started pulling back funding. And one idea that was tossed out there, and I don't know that it was sort of a resolution to this, but was that, you know, if students, it was a kind of us or them sort of situation. If students support, you know, and kind of stand up for the student newspaper, they'll say, that's fine, take, you know, my student fees don't need to go to cover the student newspaper, but what I'll do is pay a subscription fee for the student newspaper on my own. And so if students who, you know, don't want to support that institution, they don't have to, but other people, you know, almost a kind of pay what you wish sort of situation. You might even find alumni who are willing to support it that way as well. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting proposal. Whether it's lasting or, you know, kind of a permanent solution to find year after year students who would come in and say, yeah, you know, I'll pay $50 a year for the student newspaper on top of my books, on top of my meal plan, on top of, you know, other sorts of things. But I thought that was sort of at least an interesting
Well, that's
kind of
interesting.
response.
I would have taken a different response. I would have sued them. You know, there's precedent out there. There's a lot of student organizations that would not be able to do this for a club or something. But what you're really doing when a board takes that public money, because it's funneled through a public university, when it takes it away from you, they're punishing you for your speech. And I think there's a lot of precedent out there that says that's illegal. I would just find a local attorney who wanted to have some fun, and I would just sue them.
Another question? Got somebody way in the back. I see a hand.
So earlier you kind of touched on how a lot of people in this country aren't educated on the First Amendment rights and stuff like that. And I was just wondering if you saw the need for the government to kind of come back in and go to the education system and say, look, you really need to be covering this because this is something our students know. I was educated overseas, and it's really pushed down there. I mean, we were taken through how to access information from the government, use our Freedom of Information Acts, or rights we had to get stuff from the government. Do you see them getting involved in that to re-educate the populations, or?
Well, I know that my president is currently on a major fundraising kick to raise money to establish a civics education program that would, all of the students on campus would in some way be required to either take a class or participate in some kind of activity or go through freshman orientation. So I think that's going to have to probably be done on a case-by-case basis. I'm really curious, where did you go to school? Ha! I love New Zealand. Good for them. That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah, that doesn't happen here.
No, I think that, I mean, you know, I would even argue sort of it's, you know, about as close to a political slam dunk at any state legislature to say, you know what, I think we need to improve civic education in this country, and so, you know, here in our state, you know, we're gonna do that through, you know, a required class, you know, or bolster the government class that we offer, or whatever the case might be, to improve that. I mean, I think that it's, as I say, I think that's a pretty easy sell. You know, and even if it's going to take some money, which is always what it comes down to, I think that that's something that you could do, and I don't think that it's hard to make the case that that's something that that is needed. I mean, I think that civics education is not at the state that it should be in this country, and of course it extends beyond the First Amendment and into sort of all realms of understanding how the government works and its three co-equal branches and open records laws at the state and federal level, and all these kinds of things that, you know, especially, you know, it's never been easier to sort of be an engaged citizen without being a journalist or without having, you know, a lot of means to kind of have free time to spend in, you know, in public meetings or in courtrooms or things like that. So I think you know, that's, as I say, I think that's easy and obvious. But
Spoken as a man who was able to get the student protection, high school student protections through the legislature this year. Congratulations. You know, education, particularly K-12 education, is a state function. So you would have to push that through, and I think there would be varying degrees. Where I live, people are so STEM-centric and very reading and STEM. That's basically what they focus on. And other supportive things like the debate and drama and the arts have really fallen by the wayside in this push to compete in the STEM arena. And I'd love to see something like that happen. But Patrick, you now have experience in getting something like that through the legislature, so show us how to do it.
okay. Another question to bail me out?
Thanks. This question is for Trevor. In the article you wrote for The Intercept with Glenn Greenwald, you said some of the most important stories in contemporary journalism have come from media outlets obtaining and publishing materials that were taken without authorization or even in violation of the law. But this was about the WikiLeaks publication of the emails from the Democratic National Committee and from John Podesta. But in this case, playing devil's advocate, isn't it quite different because all our intelligence agencies agree that these came from Russian interference with our electoral process? What if Julian Assange knew that these emails were sourced from Russia? Will that change your interpretation?
I mean, I think it's a good question, but the DNC wasn't actually even alleging that Assange knew they came from Russia. But I think the real problem with that lawsuit, and if anybody doesn't know, so the Democratic National Committee sued the Trump administration, Russia, and WikiLeaks for a variety of things last week. But the particular aspects of WikiLeaks which I found so concerning, and this isn't a defense of WikiLeaks, it's really a worry that a precedent, if this were successful, this precedent could be used against all sorts of other news organizations, was that, it wasn't just WikiLeaks that published a lot of those emails. So those emails ended up, at least some of them, showing up in the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, and the legal theory that the DNC is using in that case would essentially apply to all those other newspapers as well. They even, there was one count in there in which they said that anytime WikiLeaks published campaign strategies or communications or any other campaign documents, this was an act of economic espionage and a violation of trade secrets. And what worries me about that is not that is not about WikiLeaks per se, but about the idea that newspapers report on this type of material all the time. Whether it's information given to them by insiders on campaigns, when campaigns are starting to tank, they start reporting on all of the campaign's strategy, all of the infighting within inside campaigns. And yes, it seems that this case was particularly nefarious because everyone now believes that it was Russia behind these hacks. But if China hacked into the IRS and sent the New York Times Donald Trump's tax returns, would everybody have the same position on that? That should be something that Donald Trump should be able to sue over, and not sue the person who actually did the hacking, which is a crime in that case. In the case of the DNC, but it's the actual publishing of the material that is of question. And the DNC didn't even allege that WikiLeaks had knowledge of or attempted to assist in this hacking. If they did, that would be an entirely different story, and I think that everyone would agree that they were breaking the law. But it's the act of publishing which I think that we have to protect, even if it is in a particular case where we might find it distasteful or disturbing or wrong.
Thank you.
I haven't read the lawsuit, and you have, and I'm wondering about this, and I don't know, Lucy, you might have a thought on it too, but did they distinguish their case from the Bartnicki versus Vopper case in some way that, I mean, doesn't that stand for the proposition that you can publish things that were gotten sort of illegally, that if you didn't yourself participate and where the information is newsworthy?
Right, that's exactly correct. So they actually didn't go into that Supreme Court case, and that case, really established the right. I think it was in 2000 or 2001. Really established the right that even if a journalist knows something or knows information was stolen or gotten illegally by the source, as long as they did not themselves participate in the stealing or collecting of the information, then they have a First Amendment right to publish that information if it's in the public interest. And so I think that's what's at issue here.
I think we've got time for one more.
I got one. Do you see, what threats do you see in this, this thread, that the confluence between the privacy concerns, the Facebooks, Googles, Twitters as publishers or not publishers, and the potential that Congress wants to pass some regulations? I suppose there's maybe some opportunities, but all I see is threats.
Yeah, you know what? I largely agree with that. I mean, I am a huge critic of Facebook and consider myself a privacy activist, and have been writing about privacy for years. But I also am concerned when, if you watch the congressional hearings, 3/4 of the senators and members of Congress had no idea what they were talking about, probably hadn't even been on Facebook. And we're asking these people to essentially craft new laws to do what? We're not even sure. When I think a lot of times when people talk about regulating Facebook, they're not specific enough, and we don't actually know what that means. I think, if it was up to me, I think more transparency is the first option. People should have the right to know exactly what all of these types of websites collect on you, not just the information that you post yourself, but that you are emitting just by being online or surfing other websites that have nothing to do with Facebook. I think the proposal to force Facebook to post all political ads is at least an interesting one that can be explored without kind of running afoul of the First Amendment. We already have broadcast networks.
I disagree with that.
Okay, well. Oh, perfect, some disagreement, okay. Let's hear
No,
it.
but I agree with everything else you just said. I don't think you can force anybody to publish anything. I think that's sort of the corresponding notion of you can't ban someone from publishing something. Likewise, you can't force them to publish it.
Well, they would already be publishing the ad.
Mm-hmm.
And so we at least already have a framework for this when it comes to television and political advertising. So I'm not saying that I support it, but I think it's something at least we could look
Okay,
at.
that's interesting.
But please.
No, that's fine. I don't want to.
Well, so we're talking about
you.
the FEC rules on disclosure of essentially who's paying for, who's supporting political ads, which don't apply online. And one of the arguments is that so you sort of have a double standard happening on local television ads that you see during the local news. So and so supports this message, or some sort of message at the bottom that says this is who paid for this ad, and there's no requirement of that. Is that essentially? And you sort of would say that that's something that we could and could see online, and there's no reason to have sort of a double standard for the political ads that appear on Facebook versus those that appear we hear on the radio or see on television.
Yeah. If to follow up on that thought, we decided 20-some years ago that we were going to treat the internet more like we would treat a newspaper than we would treat it like broadcasting, which is more regulatable, because the theory being that there was limited spectrum and all of that. So I think if you're following through on that principle and considering that the internet is more like a print publication, I think it's very, very difficult to enforce that scheme, that regulatory advertising, campaign advertising scheme on the internet, if you're not going to do it the same thing on paper.
I'm looking at my watch and I'm seeing that it's 8:30, so I think we'll stop there. And I appreciate everybody coming out tonight, and once again, please help me in thanking our guests, Lucy and Trevor.